Good afternoon. My name is Assemblymember Mark Levine. I call this hearing, this joint hearing of the Select Committee on International and Regional Agreements, the Assembly Agriculture Committee, and the Assembly Jobs, Economic Development, and the Economy Committee to order. My name is Assemblymember Mark Levine. As chair of the Assembly Select Committee on International and Regional Agreements, I'd like to welcome you to this first informational hearing to discuss the impact of the United States trade dispute with China on California's economy. For those of you watching at home, we are live streaming, so there is an option for you to be able to follow that way. I would also like to welcome Assemblymember Susan Talamantes Eggman, chair of the Assembly Agriculture Committee. And I'd like to also, when she comes here, introduce Assemblymember Sabrina Cervantes, the chair of the Jobs, Economic Development, and Economy Committee. We, the Democratic Caucus, have been tied up in a budget discussion, which is why we ran a little bit late, in which the Assemblymember is still deep in that conversation. Since mid-2018, the United States and China have been engaged in an extended trade dispute involving retaliatory tariffs from both countries and affecting various sectors of California's economy. The extended and volatile nature of trade talks between President Trump and President Xi have affected the state's agricultural exports, the cost of imported consumer goods, and the possibility of expanded tariffs on additional Chinese goods threatens other economic sectors. Californians will undoubtedly feel an impact. According to a recent NPR article, the expansion on tariffs on imported Chinese consumer goods is expected to add another $500 a year in costs on the average American household. These are very real costs to a lot of people in the United States and a lot of Californians. And this trade dispute with China may only be the beginning, as the current administration threatens to similarly increase tariffs on imported goods from Mexico in a misguided effort to curb migration from families fleeing violence in Central America. Here today to shed some light on the United States-China trade dispute, we are honored to have Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis, two of the state's foremost international economists, and panelists representing our state's impacted economic sectors. California's economic future relies on fair, open, and expanded trade with China, Mexico, and other nations around the world, and I thank you in advance for shedding light on this important issue facing our state. I'd like to invite my co-chair for today's hearing, Assemblymember Eggman, to make some opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Levine, and thank you for pulling us all together here today to discuss this important topic. And as we see every day, it becomes more and more important. More and more developments happen. It seems like a hearing can barely keep up with reality on some days. But as a chair of agriculture, we want to talk about some of those more direct impacts. We know in 2017, California's agriculture exports totaled over $20 billion in value, representing an increase of 2.2% compared to the previous year. So every year we were climbing. Now those industries are being impacted. We know we've grown substantially, and our export and import markets are incredibly important to us. We have long enjoyed a prosperous relationship with other countries, and I've gone with the secretary to Mexico to talk about trade. We know what a viable and vital partner Mexico has been, as well as China. When I think about my own community, and I think about almonds and pistachios and cherries, as well as row crops, I know farmers are now facing not only facing weather, like is in every day of a farmer's life, facing weather, but we also know then with the trade and the tariffs, that has been impacted even more. And as we even talk about further, talking with my port commissioner, Stockton has the largest inland port in the Western Hemisphere. A lot of that product is agriculture, that they would have had a record year last year if it hadn't been for the hit of the tariffs. So these is a trickling down all across effect, and we want to try to get to understand it as best we can so that we can then take actions as pointed as we possibly can to be able to get ourselves back on track. And I want to thank again Mr. Levine and those of you who have come today to share your perspectives with us as we consider ways of going forward.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Eggman. I'm pleased to introduce and recognize Assemblymember Devin Mathis, who just joined us. Would you like to make any opening remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Levine. And, you know, I think we're all curious to what you all are seeing as regards to the effects of trade. I know with my district, you know, dealing everything from dairy to citrus to grapes to olives to you want to name it. There's a lot going on and there's a lot to be said, but hearing from you all firsthand and looking at these factors more in depth is definitely something that needed to happen. So I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mathis. And Mr. Bloom, welcome to the hearing. If you'd like to make any opening remarks. Great, thank you. My pleasure. I would like to introduce, well, we've got another member just came in. Thank you, Assemblymember Chow, for joining us. I'd like to introduce someone who's got an interesting perspective on this issue. When I asked Speaker Rendon to create the Select Committee on International and Regional Agreements, it was because we knew that there were a lot of activities that California conducted around the world, but there was never any way to coordinate that and provide any oversight from the legislative perspective. But what also was true was that there wasn't anywhere in the administration that coordinated these things as well, and Governor Newsom tapped former Ambassador and now Lieutenant Governor Lenny Kounalakis to do that. Please, I'd like to welcome you. Please come on up to provide some remarks and comments about this issue.
Thank you. That's on? Thank you so much, Committee Chairs Eggman and Levine, and members of the committee. It is a great honor to be here, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to address the impacts to California from rapidly changing policies surrounding international trade. I'd like to start by noting that the federal government of the United States and the U.S. Congress have the exclusive jurisdiction to set trade policy for the nation under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. However, because of the size of the California economy and our interdependence on foreign trade, federal trade policy impacts California disproportionately from other states. That's why this hearing is so important. By entering into the public record testimony from experts and stakeholders who are here today, the federal government will have the opportunity to hear about the impacts of its actions on our state's economy and the concerns that stakeholders are expressing. Recent trade policies announced and carried out by the Trump administration have been deeply disruptive across the country. Jay Timmons, CEO of National Association of Manufacturers, called recent threats surrounding tariffs on goods to Mexico a Molotov cocktail of policy. As a former U.S. ambassador, I can tell you that it is highly unusual to have a process for trade policy shaped this way. It's reckless and erratic. The public is hearing about proposed policy via tweets, and the White House is using presidential powers to circumvent Congress, often to circumvent its own advisors and government agencies. I'd also like to say at the start that there is wide recognition that the Trump tariffs are primarily impacting American companies and American consumers, more than the countries whose goods are being targeted. I suspect we will be hearing a lot of testimony about this today. I'd also like to start my presentation by going over the timeline of the imposition of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs over the last 11 months, because most of the recent disruption has come from a back and forth escalation of tariffs on U.S. and foreign goods. There are three basic categories based on the legal authority being used to levy them. The first set of tariffs imposed by the administration are referred to as 232 tariffs. Back in March of 2018, the administration imposed 25% tariffs on imported steel and 10% on imported aluminum, claiming authority under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 on the grounds of national security. These 232 tariffs raised the price of aluminum and steel in the United States and had an immediate impact on California's construction industry and our aerospace industry. According to the Peterson Institute, these tariffs increased the price of steel in the U.S. by about 10%. That's about an $11.5 billion per year cost to the U.S. economy. On May 19th, just a few weeks ago, and after 14 months in place, the administration gave exemptions to Mexico and Canada, relieving some of the pressure on the supply of steel and aluminum to the United States. 232 tariffs have also been levied against the European Union and Japan. On May 17th, President Trump proclaimed motor vehicles and related parts imports from these countries a national security threat. He directed USTR to negotiate a resolution. The next category of tariffs that are related to Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974. Section 301 authorizes the President to take all appropriate action to obtain the removal of any act, policy, or practice of a foreign government that is unjustified, unreasonable, or discriminatory, and that burdens or restricts U.S. commerce. In 2017 and 2018, Section 301 investigations determined that China had repeatedly violated fair trade provisions. Instances of intellectual property theft, forced joint ventures, and a failure to live up to agreements and their enforcement is well documented and have negatively impacted California companies. While there is wide recognition that China has fallen short in meeting its obligations on fair trade, there is a great deal of disagreement about the process the administration has chosen to address it. Let me quickly go through the timeline of events. In May of 2018, the President announced U.S. plans to proceed with Section 301 actions against China in response to their violations. In July of last summer, the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of imported Chinese goods, and China immediately retaliated with tariffs on U.S. exports in the same amount. In August, the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs on an additional $16 billion of imported Chinese goods, and China immediately retaliated with tariffs on U.S. exports, again in the same amount. In September, in response to Chinese retaliatory tariffs, the U.S. imposed tariffs on approximately $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, including many everyday consumer products like electronics and housewares. China again retaliated with tariffs on another $60 billion of American-made products. On December 1st, President Trump announced new negotiations with China and declared the September 24th tariffs will remain at 10%, creating a partial reprieve. In May, so just about 3 weeks ago on May 10th, the President tweeted that negotiations are moving too slowly, and the U.S. increased tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods from 10% to 25%. Also about 2 weeks ago, President Trump announced a $16 billion aid package for U.S. farmers who've been hurt by the tariffs dispute. It is targeted toward Midwestern farmers who produce crops like corn and soybeans, not crops that make up the majority of California exports. Congressman Jim Costa from the Central Valley called the package rushed and poorly planned, and said that California products will receive a different and possibly reduced level of aid. Finally, on the issue of 301 tariffs, the administration is now proposing to levy tax on 25% on all goods imported from China, which are not yet subject to the 301 tariffs. These are valued at an additional $325 billion worth of goods. 301 tariffs on Chinese goods and the retaliatory tariffs imposed by China are having an enormous impact on the California economy. Again, I believe we are going to hear a lot about these impacts today. As I began preparing this testimony last week, I did not think there would be a third category of tariffs. But on Thursday, in a tweet, President Trump announced he will impose a 5% tariff on all goods coming from Mexico as of June 10th. He added that the rate will escalate by 5% each month until October, when they would reach 25%. This proposed policy has been met with a swift reaction from President Lopez Obrador, who is calling for talks. Mexican trade negotiator Jesus Seade warned that if trade talks fail, quote, it would mean a trade war. The legal justification being used for the current round of proposed tariffs falls under yet another category. It is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEEPA. The basis parallels the justification for 232 tariffs, that it is a matter of national security, this time connected to immigration. Governor Newsom has made it clear that there is no national security crisis on our border. It is a manufactured humanitarian crisis. This is why the governor proposed investments in humanitarian assistance for asylum-seeking families and redeployed members of the California National Guard from our border to help combat the risk of wildfires. According to the Congressional Research Service, no president has used IEEPA ever to place tariffs on imported products from a specific country or on products imported to the United States in general. As a former U.S. ambassador, I am unaware of any time in recent history that a president has used the threat of tariffs against a friendly nation to force action on a separate foreign policy issue, in this case, immigration. Senator Chuck Grassley, a Republican from Iowa, said in a statement yesterday, quote, trade policy and border security are separate issues. This is a misuse of presidential tariff authority and counter to congressional intent. The potential impact of this to California is enormous. For a sense of scale of the importance of Mexico as a trading partner with California, exports to Mexico total $30.7 billion annually. This is larger than the entire budgets of 41 individual states. It's also worth mentioning that this policy appears to be in direct conflict with the Trump administration's negotiations around USMCA, the U.S., Mexico, and Canada Agreement, which is an update to NAFTA and for which the administration has been pushing to schedule a congressional vote. So, what does all of this mean to us here in California? There is a long line of distinguished experts, economists, and stakeholders here today to go into detail. You will hear about the impact of these policies on California's agricultural sector, electronics, and technology exports, and on our ports and logistics sector. But I'd like to say a few words about this as well. First, California is deeply integrated into the global economy. As the 5th largest economy in the world, this should come as no surprise. Every year, we export $178 billion worth of goods and import a total of $440 billion worth of goods. California's trade infrastructure is second to none, with 11 ports and 12 international airports throughout the state, 13 if we count Tijuana, which is connected to San Diego. The Los Angeles and Long Beach Port Complex is the nation's largest container port, and about $1 billion worth of goods come through its doors every day. California is #1 in the country in exports and agriculture, machinery and electronics, and #1 in goods and services, exports and imports. Logistics, freight, warehousing, and e-commerce industries have developed around California's international trade, building a scale that is unmatched in the country. An estimated 20% of all the jobs in our state are dependent on international trade. That's about 5.4 million California jobs. So this is truly an issue that affects everyone. Again, today's speakers will do a deep dive into the impacts on California on the current trade disputes. And I am looking forward to hearing from all the presenters. But there are a few data points I'd like to share in closing. First, we've been told by officials at the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach that the dollar volume of shipments to China declined 14% during the first 3 months of 2019 compared to the same period of 2018. 14%. We also know that rural areas of the state are suffering disproportionately as rural industries like agriculture and logistics have significant exposure to changes in the trade regime. The effect on changing tariffs is also disproportionately felt by California's small and medium-sized businesses. They do not have the same resources as large companies to shift their supply chain or find new international customers to make up for lost business. Finally, once supply chains change, it is very hard to get them back. For example, last year, California wine exports to China fell nearly 25% after taxes and tariffs on wine entering into China from the United States reached nearly 80%. Demand has quickly been absorbed by increased exports from Chile and Australia that have seen their wine exports to China surge. It is very possible that we will not see an end to these trade disputes anytime soon, and our state will be impacted for some time. This is particularly true with the 301 tariffs on China. Now that the procedure to take action on 301 violations has begun, there is a great deal of consensus, including bipartisan consensus, that the federal government should not leave the negotiating table until there is meaningful resolution. With the level of complexity involved and China's recent signals that they are not willing to bend on some key provisions, this could take a long time. As to the current situation with Mexico, I must say it is dismaying in many ways. Mexico is a friend of the United States and a valued partner. California's cooperation with Mexico has supported a safe, secure, and prosperous border. Our trade relationship has brought opportunity and prosperity to both sides. At least 14 million Californians are of Latino heritage. Our partners in Mexico can be assured that California stands ready to speak out as to the importance of our relationship and our friendship. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor. You made a couple of points that I wanted to ask you to expand on, and you have a unique perspective. How do President Trump and President Xi undo what's been done? What is a resolution in pursuit of what the policy goals might be?
Well, I think that's why it was so important to really lay out the sequence of events and the legal regime that is governing all of this. Because once the U.S. has concluded that 301 violations have occurred, and once the president begins the process to address those violations, you can't just go back to the status quo. You have to sit down at the negotiating table and really address the nature of the violations that have been taking place. And they have been very, very serious. California companies from one side of the state to the other will tell you stories of trying to do business in China and being required to enter into limited partnerships with groups that they really don't feel they need, but they're required to do it in order to be able to do business there. There are many stories surrounding Visa, a California company that had green light after green light to begin to advance their business model in China, particularly around electronic payments. And because of additional requirements, their ability to enter in the market was stalled and frustrated. And in the meantime, other Chinese companies, WeChat, for instance, came in and captured the market share. So these kinds of stories and examples are replete. Of course, the theft of intellectual property, the requirement to willingly hand over intellectual property, these are things that have been a problem for quite some time. And again, I think there is a great deal of agreement that these are problems that need to be addressed. But now that the Section 301 process has begun, going back to the status quo is just not advisable. The federal negotiators have got to get meaningful change around these problems that have been endemic for quite some time.
Thank you. Are there other questions from other panelists? Assemblymember Chow.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start off by thanking you for being here, Lieutenant Governor, for sharing your insights with us. If I could follow up on the chair's remark, what can California do to help rectify some of the situation or to backfill some of the needs that have been left behind with the trade war?
Well, look, it's why I began my remarks by reminding everyone that trade is the purview of the federal government. And it is extremely frustrating for our state, which if it were a country, which it is not, but if it were, would be the 5th largest economy in the world. The actions that are being taken by the federal government related to trade and a host of other things, but we're talking about trade right now, are seriously impacting us, impacting our economy. And if California's economy is negatively impacted, the country's economy will be negatively impacted. So the fact that the federal government is moving forward in such a cavalier, chaotic, unpredictable way that is having clear negative effects to California is, it doesn't make any kind of rational sense. It is self-harm. So what exactly can we do about it? First of all, speaking up and speaking out is critically important, which is why I really commend you for holding this hearing today, because I know who's in this room, and you are going to have on the record some very specific, very detailed, clearly authenticated ramifications of this trade and tariffs dispute. And that's critical because you have to start with having the facts put into the public record. And then beyond that, I think it is incumbent upon everyone in this state, but particularly our leaders and our elected officials, to be speaking out at every opportunity of the impacts of these policies on our economy.
Assemblymember Eggman.
Thank you, and thank you again for your presentation. From your purview as an ambassador, have you ever seen, I mean, historically, somebody making policy by tweets and this kind of erratic without any specific plan, but it seems to be incredibly reactive? And from your impression, what has that perception done around the world as others are thinking about investing or not investing with us? And I guess the ramifications if we continue down this path of policy by tweets and seemingly no plan, but just reactions.
Chairwoman Eggman, I think this is really the greatest shame, which is that the environment, the climate around trade that's being created by this type of process is having a deeply chilling effect on trade. And so even beyond the tariffs, which have a measurable impact, when the climate is dampened, you unnecessarily hinder the work of companies that are trying to expand and do business. When you have uncertainty and unpredictability, companies get more conservative. They pull back. In terms of supply chain, countries that are importing California products are thinking, well, maybe it's only going to go on for another week or another year. Maybe this is going to go on for a long time. So we need to look to other sources for our imports because California is no longer as reliable as a result of this unpredictability. So I think, again, that is probably, of everything, the most damaging thing because it's damage that there's just absolutely no reason whatsoever for us to be doing this to ourselves as a country.
I'd like to introduce two other Assembly members who joined us, Assembly members Aguiar-Curry and Assembly members Rivas. Thank you. I wanted to connect with you or to follow up on some points that you've made, particularly now as you're chair of the California International Affairs and Trade Development Interagency Committee, and also the fact that we have a partnership with an outside organization for our China Trade Office. What has the chatter or feedback that you've received about our push to have further exports to China been like from those different agencies and that trade office? Has there been an immediate response from them about what if the reception they're getting, if the market has been chilled immediately, if those tariffs increase costs in such a way that there's just no reason to ever try to get back into that market?
So California has a partnership with the Bay Area Council. We're actually reviewing that relationship right now. I could pick up the phone, but I'm fairly certain that their concerns are deep, and I do regularly speak with representatives from there. As far as our interagency committee, it's really already been a very valuable tool because many years ago, 2004, the California Department of Commerce was eliminated. But the activity of California around international affairs has continued. So as you noted, looking for ways to coordinate our activity is really important because we find efficiencies and a better way to be, more ways to be impactful. So we had our first committee meeting just last week, and there are three kind of general areas that are already emerging where California will continue to engage actively in the international realm. One is on climate. We talked a little bit, I mentioned the constraints that we have on trade. We also, of course, are constrained when it comes to immigration policy. But in climate, because the California legislature and the governor actually now over the last 3 governors have made reduction of emissions such a key priority, and we have these aggressive 2045 goals. This is really an important story that we can and should tell on the national stage. So that's something that when you look at the various agencies, frankly, whether it's transportation or EPA or air resources, there's a lot of area for collaboration. And then the other areas, of course, that have risen to the top are trade. And GoBiz actually is the staff of our committee. And again, 20% of the jobs in the state, 5.4 million jobs in the state of California, have some connection to international trade. So it's an enormous priority for GoBiz, and they don't, Lenny Mendonça, who's the head of GoBiz, sits on the committee. He's the vice chair of the committee, but then the staff of GoBiz staffs the committee as a whole. And then, I think that we are so truly impacted by immigration that this is another part of the conversation that we have, but it does run into some of these similar constraints.
Thank you. Assemblymember Mathis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lieutenant Governor, you've gone over a lot of the numbers quite well. My question is, we all know California has the most stringent regulations in the entire country. And so is there any plan to maybe give some regulation relief to our industries during this period that they're going through this tariff war until the federal government does anything different? I mean, because as you said, you know, it's a federal issue, and we've got to look at what we're going to do as a state to help our industries out. So is there anything that's being looked at or being discussed that we all should be aware of?
I think maybe the committee members might be able to answer that a little better than me, but I will tell you that I think it's really important to recognize that industries are suffering right now, suffering under these terrible policies of the Trump administration and the erratic way that they are going about pursuing these policies, and looking at any opportunity to be able to help businesses here in this difficult climate, I think, is something that certainly should be looked at.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from committee members? I want to introduce Assemblymember Ramos. Thank you for joining us. Lieutenant Governor Kinolakis, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your leadership on this issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Next, I would like to introduce and welcome two economics professors from UC Davis. We've got Professor Daniel Sumner, professor of the Department of Economics and director of Agricultural Issues Center at University of California, Davis, and Dr. Catherine Russ, associate professor, Department of Economics at the University of California, Davis. It's a lot of chairs. You can just push it out of the way. Yeah. Dr. Sumner, please.
Yes, thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I really appreciated listening to the Lieutenant Governor, who I think provided lots of insights to what's been happening over the last few years with respect to trade. And she highlighted one point that I want to reinforce, and that is here we're talking about tariff actions that have actually happened, but even the threats themselves have consequences, and we all know that businesses thrive on a certain amount of stability, understanding what the rules are as they go forward. And I'll give you one example. When at the beginning of the new administration, when the threat of eliminating NAFTA was in the air, buyers of California agricultural products in Mexico, long-term customers of California companies who they valued as suppliers, immediately got on the phone and checked with alternative sources. So in the case of dairy products, a very important product that we export to Mexico, the Mexican buyer said, sorry guys, we love you, but we're checking with Fonterra in New Zealand just to see what they've got for us. The last thing you want your customers to do is to check with your competitors. And it's that sort of instability or concern that I think pervades all of this. And it's not just calculate the effect of a specific tariff on a particular market that we have to think about. Here at the Agricultural Issues Center at the University of California in the Department of Agricultural Economics, we work together with the California Department of Food and Ag, Secretary Ross, and we have done for close to 25 years, putting together trade data relevant for California agriculture. And as the Lieutenant Governor emphasized, California is not a separate country. We don't have separate trade data for California that comes from the Commerce Department, the Federal Commerce Department, for example. So what we do is do a number of estimates, approximations. We work closely with the industry. And I've left with you three tables that sort of summarize the pattern of agricultural exports out of California, and you can refer to those at your leisure. The point is we have a wide variety of products we export, starting with almonds, pistachios, dairy products, the other tree nuts, wine has already been mentioned. These are all very important export items, but it goes down to table grapes, tomatoes, and on and on and on. It's $20 billion, which we heard, and those are exported to really a nice, broad portfolio of destinations, starting with Canada as number one, and EU and Canada are sort of back and forth together. But China, together with Hong Kong, which have to be thought of really together for agricultural trade, come in number 3 and have gone ahead of Japan over the last several years. So China, the China-Hong Kong nexus is a very important part of a destination for a whole range of agricultural products, tree nuts, but wine also, and alfalfa hay, surprisingly. So it's just an important part of the world. I also want to say that the trade turmoil that we're facing is not just China, and we've heard Mexico mentioned several times already this afternoon. But Turkey and India and other markets have also been hit with our steel tariffs, which we heard sort of started this current mess, and then they naturally retaliated because they thought those were inappropriate sorts of tariffs. I also want to reinforce, and I give you a chart there for which agricultural exports are most crucial, that is, which products for which exports are most crucial. And again, it's a wide range. For every one of those items, they hire farm workers. And those are the most vulnerable people in California economy. There's just no question about it. So while we talk about the businesses and we talk about the export losses of companies, I think it's very important to go back to the workers. And I'll just give you a quick example. We've talked about cherries over the last 2 weeks because we had some unusual rains. Well, when you lose part of a cherry crop, either it's because of tariffs or you can't market them, you can't sell them, you can't harvest them. The people that first face that vulnerability are the hired farm workers that, frankly, this time of the year are scrambling trying to find some work. And when you lose a crop, either due to an export restraint or in this last week it was weather, I just want to encourage to remember those people because they're really crucial to the story here. We heard about the tariffs coming on. Let me give you an example, and I have a chart on page 4 of the document I gave you, which shows you the crop year or the marketing year pattern for prices for walnuts. I'm just going to give you one example because that's all we have time for. This would have been a good year for walnuts, and you see what happens. Walnuts are now 60% below where they were a couple of years ago in terms of price. The walnuts will get sold. You can't, you don't think of them as a perishable crop, but you can't store them from one year to the next. So they're going to be sold. The quantity will move, but at much lower prices because the markets that they used to go to have been closed. And if you gave us 10 years, if somebody would have announced 10 years from now we're going to do a tariff move, then people would have rearranged markets and this and that. But this didn't happen that way. This was at harvest, in fact, is when these tariffs hit, and they've continued. The final thing I want to mention is the vulnerability.
This is painful. I'm a walnut farmer.
Well, I know you're from.
Would you like to see all the trees I'm pulling out?
I think you may be very near my home of Davis, in fact, in winters. Yeah. Well, now I'll mention pistachios, which I think Assemblyman Mathis mentioned earlier. Pistachios are a complicated case. So we would have seen the same thing, I predict, with walnuts, except it turns out Iran had the worst pistachio crop in its history. It's the only other place that competes with California in the export market. So you might, if you didn't pay attention to these markets, you might say, oh, well, they weren't hurt. Well, anybody in agriculture knows if in the years when you have an opportunity to make some money, you better make the money because the next year you're going to be making up for losses. And this is a year when we could have had substantial increases in pistachio prices, and instead they've sort of been stable. So maybe somebody at USDA is looking at that and saying, hey, you guys in pistachios, you didn't have any losses. You sold the crop. Well, of course they sold the crop. They had to. It's not, this isn't soybeans and corn. You can't just store it for years. So they sold the crop. They didn't get a lower price than last year, but what they lost was the but-for. They really needed to make the high prices this year to make up for the challenges they were facing earlier. Let me finish then with just 3 final remarks. We've already heard the allusion. The USDA has announced some compensation for the growers, mostly oriented towards the Midwest, the grain, soybeans, the growers that have traditionally gotten USDA subsidies. Well, most California commodities aren't in that category. Most of our commodities have not traditionally gotten the subsidies. The USDA doesn't know the name and address of every grower in California like they would for a corn grower or a soybean grower. That makes it harder, and it means our growers have gotten much less relative to the size of their losses. Obviously, California agriculture has been working in Washington trying to fix that, and we're hopeful that the next round will fix some of that in terms of compensation. And that's something that you folks can all do, is support our industries in their efforts in Washington, either through our federal delegations or somehow. The other thing I want to say is that the basic principle about prosperity for international trade is stability. And so anything we can do to reestablish that stability, I think, is a crucial thing. And I gave you the illustration of instability creating by just threatening to do things. And the more we can get away from that, the better. And the final thing I'll say is none of this should be understood as saying that China has been blameless, for example. No, I've never heard anyone say, nobody in business, not members of the elected community, saying, oh, well, China should get a free ride, they're okay. But what I will say is we have well-established and, in fact, effective institutions for dealing with people that violate trade agreements. And the WTO is an effective institution. The United States just won 2 major trade cases against China. They'll appeal, we'll win the appeals, and we will then have the whole world behind us in bringing sanctions against China on those 2 agricultural cases. And I would hope that it's not too late to take a step back and use the institutions that we've established over the years for settling dispute in a legal way. And in that way, we would have not the U.S. going alone and everybody else against us, but the U.S. together with lots of other countries that actually do agree with us on concerns about Chinese trade patterns. Let me stop there. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sumner, and we'll go to Dr. Russ before we then cry about our walnuts a little bit more and go a little bit more on those issues. Dr. Russ, thank you.
So thanks very much to the Select Committee and the standing committees for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today on the U.S.-China tariff war. So I hope you can hear me. I have a little bit of a, okay, great. So there are 3 areas where I was asked to comment today on the impact of the tariffs. First, on consumers. So as Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis explained in really helpful detail, there is currently a 25% tax on about $250 billion worth of goods from China as they cross the border into the United States. A feasible range of costs for the average household, just for the cost of these taxes, not the distortions that they generate, is between $300 and $800, with $500 being a focal point that actually fell into the estimates of several studies. And the cost of these tariffs you can think of as similar to a sort of hidden sales tax between 0.5% and 1%. But it's not spread evenly across goods like a sales tax would be, so it tends to be more distortionary for that reason. When economists factor in the hang-ups involved in consumers having to substitute away from goods that they like toward goods that they like less and sourced from less efficient producers, we get these dead weight losses that's what we call these efficiency losses in public finance. Those could be 2 to 3 times just the cost of the taxes themselves. So the cost for the average household, if you factor those in, could be quite enormous. In terms of jobs, so China is the destination for nearly 10% of California's exports. There are more than 53,000 jobs and 2,500 businesses located in California that may be particularly vulnerable to retaliatory tariffs by China due to the fact that China is the destination for more than 20% of their industry's exports to the world. So China's a major export market for their industries. So So that's one reason why some industries may be vulnerable, because China's a major market. Another reason why some industries might be more vulnerable than others is because China's retaliatory tariff on their goods is 20 or 25% instead of 0 to 5%. So if we look at industries that might be particularly vulnerable for one of these reasons, they include wood products, so logging and timber, agriculture, as Professor Sumner explained in just beautiful detail, fish and marine products, oil and gas, mining and quarrying, industrial machinery, and motor vehicle-related manufacturing, cosmetics and skincare, and wine and spirits, as is in your background report. The balance of jobs created in industries that are protected by the tariffs, because some industries actually are protected by the tariffs, and because they're able to raise their prices under this protection from competitors in China or elsewhere, depending on the tariff in place, they can sometimes expand employment. But the balance of jobs created in these protected industries versus jobs lost in contracting industries tends to be negative in the estimates that I've seen so far. I haven't seen estimates in particular for California yet, but for the country as a whole, nationally, I've seen anywhere from 155,000 to 900,000 jobs as a net loss, so a net loss of 155 to 900,000 jobs just for the current tariffs, so not for the tariffs if they're expanded to more products. In terms of GDP, the tariffs are likely to shrink the size of the U.S. economy and be a headwind for U.S. GDP growth. The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation estimates the current tariffs will shrink the overall size of the U.S. economy, of which, as you know, California is a huge part, by $50 billion. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York Liberty Street blog published estimates based on one of the best, just top quality academic studies on the topic, suggesting that tariffs could shrink the size of the U.S. economy by $95 billion. These are only the tariffs in place right now. And the vast majority of that $95 billion actually came from efficiency distortions just from this last round of the increased tariffs on the Chinese goods that Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis mentioned, on the $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, raising the tariff from 10 to 25%. Just that knocked up this estimate of the hit to the U.S. economy by almost $80 billion. China accounts for 1/3 of global growth. And this is, and China is also an important source of demand for a lot of developing countries, commodity exporting countries. So any slowing in China's economy could generate headwinds for U.S. GDP growth through its effect on global growth and our export markets elsewhere. So, thank you.
Dr. Russ, thank you. I want to introduce Assemblymember Bernard Horvath, who just joined us. Thank you for coming. And you just touched upon something that a lot of people are concerned about. There's been a lot of data coming out that is indicative of a near-term recession, something that's not too far away. And you're talking about numbers that shrink jobs and shrink our overall economy. All of that seems to hasten an economic downturn that would be recessionary. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of how quickly those numbers could become reality, or are they projected? How soon will we feel that?
It's hard to estimate exactly what the timing of these contractions would be, in part because of the timing issue that Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis and Professor Sumner mentioned. Because of the uncertainty, some of the contraction is already happening in terms of dampening investment. I can tell you that even yesterday, major forecasters in the private sector were coming out, knocking 0.5% off of their predictions for U.S. growth should the tariff war continue or worsen. We've also seen downward revisions in forecasted growth for the global economy by the IMF. So I believe that we're already seeing some drag. It's hard to see it because Professor Sumner was talking about the counterfactual with pistachio prices, right? So we've been in a recovery for, basically 10 years now. And so we've been on this upswing. And so it's hard for people to see the headwinds that are kind of dampening the growth that we might see without the uncertainty and the distortions of tariffs having their impact on the economy.
Do other members have any questions at this point? Yes, Dr. Eggman.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, to go back to the issue around farm workers, both as workers, but then also on the impact on the economy. It seems like there's a double whammy right now. You have the tariffs in addition to kind of the chaos at the border, where, and everything I've heard as the chair of Ag Committee is about the problem of being able to find enough labor right now. So can you comment on those two things coming together at the same time?
There's certainly no question that growers have a hard time finding workers, but during certain times of the year when there's certain tasks. And what I want to emphasize is farm workers typically have a hard time putting together more than 140, 150 days a year of work, even if they're working full time. 1,500 hours is and because when one farm is hiring in an area, everybody is hiring in that area, and then you feel the shortage of workers, and at that time, everybody can work. But it's on the edges of that when the farm workers are scrambling, trying to get jobs. And so these things can exist at the same time. It can be certainly the case that here in Winters, California, there are certain times when the growers are saying, gee, I wish I could find more workers. A month later, the workers are saying, I wish I could find a job. And that's the seasonal nature of agriculture. So I think both of those things are going on. We do know that hired farm worker wages have been going up gradually in California for a while. And that's something that's positive, and I think for workers and growers, frankly, every grower I've ever talked to said, I wish I could pay higher wages. I would like to pay higher wages, but the market realities make that hard. And having these kind of tariffs in place that dampen prices make it that much harder on the growers. And so I think it's troublesome that all these issues are there at the same time. But I think what I like to do is always highlight, because people can say, oh, see, we can talk about billions of dollars of here, and I don't know what $1 billion is, frankly. I can't picture it. But if somebody tells me, here's a family that lost their job, even I can figure out what that means. And when I found it compelling a few months ago when one of the wine growers down in the Lodi area was saying they were planting a new vineyard. They were replacing a vineyard, and they use steel posts when they plant vineyards. And this particular vineyard, between the time they planted to when they were getting ready to do it, the tariffs came on for steel and aluminum. The bill they were going to get from the steel guy was $50,000 higher, where I know what $50,000 looks like. I may not know what $1 billion looks like. I know what 50. So here's just a guy, just a family, and they chose not to do it. They said, well, maybe next year. Well, there were some workers that were ready to go, and they couldn't do it because of, in that case, it was the cost of imports. And I really like the fact that we think about this both as the imports taxes, that's what tariffs are, the taxes on imports hurting our economy, and the lack of export access hurting our economy. And it's both ways. Trade is actually good for the economy, and Professor Russ did a very good job of highlighting these losses. And we call them dead weight because they're like dragging a dead weight for the economy. And I think that's something to keep in mind.
So we've got subsidies that really boost Midwest growers, really misses out on California growers, but nothing on the hit to consumers more broadly. The lower income consumers, of course, the worst. $500 on a $50,000 or $30,000 income is a whole lot of money for people. On a $250,000 income, perhaps a little bit less painful. What will those impacts be like? Will people be able to, on those kind of larger aggregate data samples, be able to absorb $500, or will this drag people further down economically, people who probably have less than $500 in savings in their bank account can't have an economic emergency in their lives without perhaps losing a car because they can't make a car payment, or not being able to make rent, or some other very hard choice. Can you speak to that at all?
There's an interesting statistic put out. It just came out 2 weeks ago. I think it's a Fed statistic, a survey of how many households would have difficulty absorbing a surprise $400 cost. And it's not a small fraction of the population. The exact number is escaping me right now, but I think it was about a third of households would have difficulty covering a surprise $400 cost. The $500, it applies to a household making about $60,000 a year. So it's graduated across. So if you spend more income, then you're going to have higher costs associated with this. So the richest households may have $1,500 to $2,000 in these extra hidden taxes that they'll be paying. The reason why we say it's regressive, nonetheless, that it falls more heavily on lower income households nonetheless, is because as a fraction of income, these households spend more. So they spend more on consumption. They have less to put away in savings. And because of that, just like any sales tax, it's regressive. So that's why it falls more heavily on people that have to spend a higher fraction of their income.
Any further questions, colleagues? Mr. Shao.
I could follow up on that point. The $500 per household or per consumer, I presume most of the items being considered are consisted of consumer items instead of, let's say, electronic parts or otherwise, or is that not correct?
Yeah, so actually these are based on study. So the bottom of the range that I gave you, 300 to 800, that's just a simple, okay, our goods from China are about 2% of consumption, increase the cost of those by 25%, and you end up with $300, right? So that's really back of the envelope if you only look strictly at final goods. These other studies, the more in-depth ones, not back of the envelope, have actually traced also the taxes on imported inputs from China. So factors that firms in the US use in production of final goods that eventually are purchased by US consumers. And then when you do that, you see that actually the cost of tariffs are probably quite a bit higher than $300 for the average household.
All right, so without any further questions, I want to say thank you to both of you for providing some insight onto how these tariffs are affecting California economically.
Thank you.
All right, next I would like to welcome to the next panel Matt Davis, the Director of Governmental Affairs for the Port of Oakland, Rachel Michelin, the President of California Retailers, Courtney Jensen, the Executive Director of TechNet. I don't think we have enough chairs for everybody, so we'll just take these four, and then we'll save, I don't know if that's right. You know what, Courtney, would you mind, Ms. Jensen, if we save you for the next one to have a 3 and 3? That makes sense. All right, thank you. And then we'll figure out how to do the Q&A on all of those. Well, I didn't introduce Dave, so I introduced someone else. You jumped in there earlier, but we'll take you. We got Dave Puglia, the Executive Vice President of the Western Growers Association, so we'll save the best for after you, Dave.
Finish the thought.
The other two are fantastic. No, you're all great. Really want to say thank you for joining us on this. These are really difficult issues. They're affecting your members in very serious ways, and you are leaders of extraordinarily important trade associations or member associations that represent groups impacted by this trade. So I want to say thank you for that. And we'll go, as I began to do the introductions with Mr. Davis from the Port of Oakland. Thank you.
Thank you to the chairs and to the members of the committee. My name is Matt Davis, and as you said, I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Port of Oakland. I'm here on behalf, actually, on behalf of the California Association of Port Authorities, which comprises the 11 public port commercial ports here in the state. As you've heard, international trade is a critical component of our state's economy, and our ports are vital partners in facilitating growth in the sector. California is home to the most productive system of ports in the nation, including 3 of America's largest container ports and a diverse system of specialty ports that together handle nearly 40% of all of the containerized cargo that enters the U.S. and almost a third of the nation's exports. For anyone involved in the business of international trade and involved in making plans for long-term capital investments, these last 2 years have been very challenging, to say the least, including all of our partners that ship goods through our ports. The tariffs initiated by the U.S. and the retaliatory actions by China and other trading partners have exposed a significant amount of cargo to higher costs and threatened their competitiveness. The Port of Los Angeles, for example, relies on China for about 60% of its total trade volumes. In Oakland, in where we have a relative 50-50 balance of import and export trade, China still represents over a third of the goods that move through our ports, including many ag goods. The current tariffs that have been initiated by the U.S. alone have exposed approximately 20% of containerized cargo imported through our ports, which has over $63 billion in trade value. The next round of tariffs threaten nearly the entire trade landscape with China. In terms of direct impacts to cargo flows, the short-term impact of the trade war has ironically been a growth in containerized imports from China. In the fourth quarter of 2018 and the first quarter of this year, containerized cargo volumes actually grew as shippers have attempted to front-load their inventories to avoid the then pending imposition of tariffs. This is not a trend that is long-term, it's short-term in nature, and it's not the sustainable type of growth that we actually welcome. Warehousing centers are starting to fill to the max, and we've heard that there's less than a 1% vacancy rates in many of the warehousing centers in the San Pedro area. In some cases, the surge in import trade has also caused congestion at port facilities, among the supply chain, and then it's rippled through and had impacts where shippers and growers were not able to get their goods to or from the ports in time. On the outbound side, we've seen export totals continue to suffer due to the countervailing duties and the tariffs. Collectively, California ports saw a decrease of between 20 to 30% in our totals that we've sent to China. A growth in empty boxes, which we've actually seen a spike, is not a way to help our economy. You'll hear from the partners in our supply chain about specific impacts to these sectors, but the negative long-term impacts of these tariffs on ag products, manufactured goods, household items, and retail is real. And then to the extent, as you also heard from our fine economists that spoke earlier, to the extent that other countries are stepping in to provide these goods to China instead of our growers and our manufacturers, means that we're losing out on long-term access to the largest consumer market, or certainly one of the large consumer markets in the world. So the long-term potential reduction in trade volume has a corresponding and direct impact on the health of the entire goods movement economy, including our ability to capitalize on our future sustainable growth, innovations, and leadership, which we certainly demonstrated for many years that we can be an example of great things happening here in the state. And so while the state may not be able to directly undo these actions being pursued at the federal level, we would certainly ask that the continued competitiveness of the international goods movement sector be considered even more strongly in light of the headwinds. I appreciate the opportunity and happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Davis, thank you very much. Ms. Michelin, please.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon, members. I'm Rachel Michelin. I'm the president of the California Retailers Association. Our mission is to preserve and enhance the retail industry in California. We protect the industry by taking a significant leadership position in the development of public policy and regulatory measures that impact our members and the business climate in the state. The California retail industry currently operates in over 400,000 retail establishments with a gross domestic product of $330 billion annually and employ more than 3.2 million people in California, 1/4 of California's total employment. We are the only statewide association representing all segments of the retail industry, including general merchandise, department stores, mass merchandisers, restaurants, convenience stores, supermarkets and grocery stores, chain drug, and specialty retail such as auto, vision, jewelry, hardware, and home stores. You can imagine this impacts us greatly. The statistics I cite regarding retail in California shows that the retail industry is a driving force of our economy. Whether a national brand or a local storefront, retailers across California support a robust economy with a strong workforce in the 5th largest economy in the world. CRA is committed to stabilizing and strengthening the economic environment to bolster existing employers, attract new ones, and most importantly, to protect our customers. I'm honored to be included today about the impact of the trade dispute and especially how it's going to pertain to our retail industry. First of all, let's remember, tariffs are taxes. right? They're paid by California's families, businesses, workers, and communities. To date, California taxpayers have paid $3.6 billion in additional tariffs. That includes $339 million in March alone. Since the trade wars began, California exports has faced $1.1 billion in new retaliatory tariffs from our trading partners, including $117 million in January. These tariffs make California less competitive. While some large retail brands have been able to absorb increased costs and not pass them on to consumers, that is not the case with this round of tariff negotiations. While we agree with the need to address longstanding issues with China's unfair trade practices and want to see a meaningful trade deal that levels the playing field for California businesses and workers, doubling down on a strategy based solely on tariffs is too great a gamble for the U.S. economy, California, and consumers across the state. We need to remember what is at stake when tariffs are put into place: California's businesses and consumers. With limited resources, smaller retailers face a disappropriate tariff burden. We know small businesses are already hurting from this trade war and can't afford more tariffs. And these small business owners can no longer be competitive in California's economy. We could see them shutting their doors and laying off employees. This could negatively impact the communities they serve and could have a major impact in our rural and underserved communities and have a detrimental effect on California's economy. When the tariffs were at the 10% level, some retailers adopted strategies to lessen the burden on consumers while hoping the increased costs would only be short-term. However, many small retailers with limited resources could not absorb those tariffs and were forced to increase their costs. Those costs are now paid by the California consumer. With tariffs now at 25%, retailers will have a harder time mitigating the impact, and consumers will start to see more noticeable price increases, especially in light of the administration's threat to target all Chinese imports. If those threats become reality, consumers will see prices rise further in a range of products, including furniture, luggage, bicycles, auto parts, appliances, sporting goods, and more. We operate in a very competitive market, and some companies may deal with the added costs in other ways in order to stay competitive on pricing. For example, the tariffs could discourage California investments relating to stores, distribution centers, employment decisions, technology, and e-commerce. All of these will impact workers, consumers, and California's economy in a negative way. Not only could California see increased prices on goods we need, but Californians are at risk of losing retail jobs. And let's remember, retail accounts for 1/4 of California's job force. So let me be clear. By more than doubling the tariffs, this will discourage investment in California, resulting in lost jobs and higher prices that California consumers will have to pay. Retailers live and breathe by their inventory cycles. Whether it's a large national chain or your small Main Street retailer, price increases ultimately depends on what they have in stock now and what stock will be subject to these tariffs. Retailers make production and sourcing decisions months and years in advance and rely on very complex supply chains. They cannot easily or quickly shift to domestic sources because those sources do not exist on a scale that they need. Even if there was an eventual switch to only sources from U.S. suppliers, it would take years to build up that base of support. The increased tariffs will hike prices for items California consumers need. The latest round of tariffs could bring the annual cost to the typical household to $831. Products like soap, manicure items, and deodorant are all on the list of goods affected by the tariffs and will cost more. Millions of Californians will stick with their old washing machine, television, computer monitor. They will refrain from buying new clothes and furniture. California families who are on fixed incomes could be greatly impacted as we see job growth decline, layoffs take place, and prices increase for needed goods across the state. As retailers are hit with higher tariffs that they can no longer absorb, as there is uncertainty in the marketplace, making it harder for retailers to make long-range supply plans, prices will increase and the final purchasers of goods will purchase less because the goods cost more. Sales declines eventually lead to unemployment cuts, Unemployment cuts result in lower consumer spending on a range of goods and services. So consumers, instead of buying that new car, the family's going to buy a used car. Families will go out to dinner less. Unemployed workers will cut even more discretionary purchases. Healthcare expenses will be postponed. Each of these decisions will have employment impacts on the California worker, the retail industry, and our economy. CRA supports the effort to achieve a meaningful trade agreement with China, and we're hopeful these negotiations get back on track. Both sides have made important progress to address the longstanding issues regarding trade, but what concerns us is that tit-for-tat tariffs will undermine any progress and lead to a prolonged trade war that will damage California's economy. We know from history that once tariffs are imposed, they don't usually come off. American consumers are still paying tariffs that were put in place during the Great Depression. The threat of tariffs on Chinese imports is too great a gamble for both the U.S. economy and for California. This level of escalation will roil our financial markets, destroy jobs, raise prices for California families, and ultimately undermine the economic gains we have seen in recent years. So what do retailers want to see? We would like the full and immediate removal of tariffs. Any deal must result in a complete rollback of existing and retaliatory tariffs. We want meaningful reforms to level the playing field for California workers and business and address longstanding unfair trade practices that put innovation at risk. We want to avoid any enforcement mechanism that would trigger more tariffs and result in long-term uncertainty. Well, what can you as California lawmakers do? California's economy could see very negative impacts if the tariff war continues. We ask state lawmakers to look at the regulations placed on retailers and understand that while some regulation, while well-intended, burdens retailers with more costs that are compounded by the proposed tariffs. By looking for ways to lessen regulation on California's retail industry, retailers can look at ways to not pass additional costs on consumers due to these tariffs, and they can protect California's jobs, California's economy, and most importantly, California's consumers. The Retail Association welcomes the opportunity to work with the Select Committee and any other interested parties on strategies to address the tariff situation in ways that will protect California's consumers, workers, and the retail industry, which again accounts for $330 billion annually and employs 1/4 of California's total employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Michelin. And we did add Ms. Jensen to this panel for subject matter harmony, which I'm grateful for. Please, Ms. Jensen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, and members. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of TechNet and our 80 member companies regarding the impact of the U.S.-China trade war on California's economy. For the past year, the U.S. and China have been engaged in a costly trade war. From the beginning, TechNet has strongly opposed the Trump administration's policy of sweeping tariffs to achieve its goal of compelling China to change its unfair trade practices. California is the world's 5th largest economy. A major reason for that success is that we are home to the world's preeminent technology industry, which helps develop life-enhancing innovations that the rest of the world wants to buy. Selling to more markets and customers abroad drives economic growth and job creation in the U.S. tech sector. In fact, U.S. tech exports supported an estimated 858,000 American jobs in 2017. California benefits the most from this. Tech is the #1 good our state exports. Last year alone, we exported to 230 foreign markets. Mexico was first, Canada was second, and China was third. However, the tariffs increase the cost of making our products, often increasing the price tag. Higher prices make them more expensive and harder to sell abroad. Competition abroad is fierce, but we are confident that the U.S. tech sector, led by California's most innovative companies, can compete with anyone on a fair and level playing field. However, fair and level is not what we have when our foreign competitors do not have to deal with these tariffs and can offer customers products similar to ours at a lower price. Tariffs are taxes that hurt Americans, consumers, workers, and businesses of all sizes. They slow the growth of the U.S. economic output and weaken demand for American products at home and abroad. In fact, one study shows that tariffs will slow U.S. economic output by $322 billion over the next decade. Over the past year, China tariffs have led to higher prices for consumers on a wide range of products that they have come to rely on. They have disrupted supply chain and threatened long-term projects such as data centers, and they have shifted capital away from long-term investments in the next wave of innovation through R&D efforts. We want to state clearly for the record that we believe China must be held accountable for its unfair trade practices, including intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, cyber attacks, and cyber espionage. We share the administration's goal of securing lasting and enforceable changes from the Chinese government that will protect American innovators and their ideas, allow U.S. companies a chance to compete on a more level playing field, and improve market access. Tariffs, however, are not the solution. Instead of pursuing tariffs on our allies and trading partners around the world, the U.S. should be working with our allies to pressure China to change its trade practices. Virtually no product in U.S.-China commerce has been left untouched by the tariffs. This includes popular consumer products that Americans have come to rely on each day, like smartphones, connected devices, and computers. California-based companies lead the world in the mobile phone and connected device industries. When companies in this space compete, it drives down prices for U.S. consumers, including lower-income Americans who can increasingly gain access to cutting-edge mobile devices. Just as important, these products have become foundational technologies and critical productivity tools for a wide range of traditional industries, including agriculture, manufacturing, healthcare, and other key parts of our economy. But putting tariffs on U.S. mobile phones and other connected devices gives our competitors in Korea, China, and elsewhere a leg up, raising prices for U.S. devices while making it harder for companies across all sectors of our economy to leverage these innovative technologies. This hurts someone living on a fixed income as much as it harms the farmer in Central Valley looking for a new mobile tools to prevent crop damage and improve yields. Networking products that comprise the modern-day infrastructure connecting us all have been hit hard, including modems, routers, switches, optical and fiber optic transceivers, network interface cards, adapters and modules, access points, remote access points, and antennas and beacons. At a moment when we are engaged in a global 5G race, the tariffs are hitting the networking products that are needed for 5G's infrastructure. Tariffs also have a negative impact on small businesses that use online platforms to sell around the world. Tariffs increase the cost of their inventory, and retaliatory tariffs hurt their ability to sell globally. Tariffs on these and many other types of products do not just hurt the tech sector, because these items are essential in our increasingly connected world. These tariffs hurt all sectors and businesses of all sizes. I'm proud to be here today with members of California's agricultural community. In recent years, TechNet has worked with elected officials and stakeholders in the Central Valley to identify ways the tech sector can be a more effective partner. It is clear that America's farmers are among the most negatively impacted by the tariff war between the U.S. and China. Their presence here today reminds us that the tariffs on technology also harm other sectors of the U.S. economy that rely on innovative technologies to run their businesses more efficiently. The Trump administration should understand that in addition to the crops being targeted, higher tariffs on technology products that farmers increasingly use to manage water, detect diseases, and make better decisions are hurting them as well. This includes robots, sensors, cameras, fuel cells, and specialized batteries, as well as cloud computing and artificial intelligence applications. In addition to farms, our products are being used each and every day to enhance communication efficiency and productivity in offices, factories, schools, hospitals, airports, and across all state government entities. These tariffs are taxes on all of them. So last year, TechNet, specifically on data center tariffs, TechNet highlighted the specific harm caused by tariffs on servers, transmission devices, and other key computing components that make up the digital infrastructure needed to build and operate data centers. Data centers are the lifeblood of an increasingly data-driven economy and can be found in every state. One study shows that once operational, the average data center actually generates $32.5 million worth of local economic activity each year. And during the construction phase, each data center generates nearly $10 million in revenue for state and local governments while employing an average of 1,688 workers. Tariffs on essential data center components such as servers and transmission devices threaten to stall this engine of economic growth. They disrupt supply chains, increase costs through de facto taxes, and inject uncertainty into business operations and local economies that host data centers. Data centers are complicated supply chain projects that rely on absolute certainty of receiving key components in a timely and cost-effective way. If critical pieces continue to be held up for delivery at a later date with higher, more unpredictable costs, companies would be incentivized to make investments and create jobs in other countries where such needless uncertainty does not exist. In essence, these tariffs not only hurt the American tech sector the administration is working to protect, but they also hurt many more workers across various sectors whose operations rely on cloud computing and data management tools. And then just briefly on R&D, so research and development is the lifeblood of innovation. Some of TechNet's member companies spend billions of dollars each year in R&D to develop new products and enhance existing ones. Overall, the U.S. currently is the global leader in R&D spending, investing more than $5 in R&D for every $1 spent by Chinese companies. However, these tariffs are taxes, and when taxes on the private sector go up, it means operating costs go up and tough decisions have to be made about competing priorities. One of the consequences of this sustained trade war is having less money to invest in R&D. When all is said and done, the impact of tariffs on R&D investments may be the most damaging consequence of all. We do not know what kinds of technological breakthroughs we will cede to our international competitors by forfeiting investments in the next wave of innovation. Members, although the focus of today's hearing is on the tariffs policies in China, we would be remiss if we did not also highlight the deep concerns and strong opposition we have to the Trump administration's newly proposed tariffs on Mexico, which were announced last Thursday. Mexico is our neighbor, our trading partner, and our ally. The California and Mexican economies have been linked for centuries and generated enormous economic opportunity for both sides of the border for both of our populations. In fact, Mexico is California's #1 trading partner. The value of California's exports to Mexico has risen more than 20% over 4 years to $30.7 billion in 2018. TechNet opposes these tariffs on Mexico, and we urge the Trump administration to abandon this plan. In conclusion, this prolonged trade war is hurting American consumers, workers, and job creators across all sectors. China must be confronted about its unfair trade practices, but high tariffs on 100% of Chinese imports will have a devastating impact on the long-term health of the U.S. economy. At the end of this month, President Trump is expected to meet with the Chinese president at the G20 summit. We are hopeful that this face-to-face meeting between the leaders will lead to a breakthrough. We urge them to listen to the concerns from California, which are being so well articulated here today. And in the meantime, TechNet and our partners will continue to urge both China and the U.S. governments to work strenuously to resolve the situation and end the tariffs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to dive into with the first 3 members of the panel. And so I want to just jump right in, particularly with the impact on retailers, which everyone sees those impacts, everyone up here. But we've seen just the incredible shrinking brick and mortar retailer, whether it's strictly apparel or even department stores that carry much more like Sears, and particularly in different quality segments. And so with China, and it's one, it has a growing middle class. Costs of producing in China have gone up, but at the same time, quality has gone up with products from China as well. Will we see those retailers that buy lesser quality, lower cost goods from regions of the world that pay less? Will we see more of those products in the United States, or will we just see a lot of these companies, continue to struggle along without shifting where manufacturing takes place?
I think it depends on who the retailer is. I think some of the, maybe the larger national brands will be able to go a little bit longer and absorb some of the increased costs. Our concern are particularly smaller retailers. I mean, there's a lot of them in California. I mean, go down to Old Sac. Those are all small retailers that are going to be negatively impacted by this, and they're going to have to make a choice. Either they can stay in business by maybe having to find other sources that are cheaper, maybe not the same quality that they were getting before, or they're going to have to close down and not be able to have their business anymore. So I think, depending on how long these tariffs continue, it's going to happen to some of the larger and larger retailer chains as well. I mean, they run on a very small profit margin. They're very competitive. They're competitive against each other. So they're always looking for ways to be competitive when it comes to pricing. And those are some of the decisions that they're going to be forced to make.
Thank you, Assemblymember Eggman.
Yeah, kind of along that same lines, I can see a scenario where larger retailers might have things off in a warehouse somewhere and can work on their supply, whereas a smaller retailer doesn't have that flexibility, right? So they're buying more. And so as we've seen in the agriculture community, as smaller farms have gone away and large corporate farms have bought them up, will we continue to see, I think, the loss of small and mid-level farms or retailers going more towards large ones or even to online shopping?
I think that could absolutely happen. And that's what's concerning, because when you go into the small towns in California, you go down the main streets and on some of these old towns, it's those retailers that are kind of where people go, they get their gossip in the community, that connects the community members. And if those retailers cannot stay competitive, they're going to go out of business. I think you're absolutely right in your comment. Some of the larger retailers do have the ability to have inventory that they could tap into, but only for so long. But pretty soon, A, these costs are going to be continued onto the consumers, and B, yes, we could absolutely see that. And I think it will eventually could affect the larger retailers when you see more, online e-commerce, which, while that's a great benefit, there are also things that we have to look out for where that is concerned. So I think you're absolutely correct. This affects each type of retailer in a different way. But I think even though a lot of our members are the larger brands, they are very concerned about particularly the small businesses and these small business owners that maybe have had this retail establishment for years that won't be able to compete anymore.
We just had a small little drugstore in my neighborhood, one of the last little neighborhood drugstores, 100 years in business, just closed their doors.
And it's sad. I mean, you mourn that loss in your community, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, further on the retail segment and apparel in particular, which I'm concerned about because there are seasonal changes. You can't keep the same goods. And people aren't going to wear the same clothes from season to season. They have to change, and of course, styles do change as well. So, how do you feel that that's going to really impact consumer choice and what options that they have, and whether or not retailers are going to be able to deal with that type of change, whether or not they have garments that can go from season to season? Have you seen any of your members dealing with that now?
Not yet, but that goes to the supply chain. That goes, can they get their goods into the U.S.? How much is it going to cost? That also is going to be impacted by what consumers are going to buy. I mean, if they're having to pay more money for their food or for the essential items that they need, and those costs have gone up, they're going to have less money to spend on some of those types of things that you're talking about. So I think you have to look at it from that perspective. But I do think that, retailers will look at how they can stay in business, how can they weather this storm, and part of it may be a reduced inventory, but they will want to do whatever they can in order to stay competitive. But you're right. In parts of the country, even here in Sacramento, it seemed like a long winter, and now we're back to 100
Well, you talked about increasing costs on deodorant. And
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. It could be, my husband and I were looking at a new refrigerator, and we should buy it now because it's going to be cheaper now than if we wait a couple of months. And I think those are some decisions that consumers are going to have to make. But then the other piece of this is that as retailers are looking to cut costs, that also means cutting jobs. And so you could have Californians who work in the retail industry not having a job anymore. And then what does that do? That adds to the problem, and it has a bigger impact. And so we really think that we hope some positive inroads where these tariffs come, because I don't think we've really understand what impact it's truly going to have unless it can, prolongs.
Well, you hit
some winter coats coming next week.
Well,
Exactly.
I did want to pivot
Yeah.
over to you, Mr. Davis, because Ms. Michelin mentioned appliances, refrigerators. You talked about storage, what's coming over in cargo ships. Is there a sector that you're seeing or did see more of that type of shipment coming in to get in ahead of those tariffs, or did that type of behavior not occur?
I think that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough visibility, at least at the port level. There's a lot of differing metrics that are used. You can measure it via value, volume, tonnage, containers. So I think I'd really sort of want to defer to some of the individual sort of sectors to sort of really, tell us where they're seeing it. I think from an overall level, we saw just a marked surge, and we were hearing, at least from every conceivable type of sector, whether it was basic manufacturing, the retail environment, from tech, just people trying to figure out, because again, at the port level, it was starting to manifest itself through boxes that we weren't expecting in the regular cycle, that were coming in off season, or certainly coming in 6 months early than what we would have thought that normal cycle would look like. And so they were getting sort of buried in a stack, and it led to, literally having to triage every single cargo owner, which is not how we want to introduce ourselves to the shipping lines.
And on that kind of bigger picture traffic issue, are you seeing container ships coming in from different ports or going out to different ports than the cross-Pacific, China, California trade?
I don't think we've seen any major disruptions in the actual strings or the shipping routes. I think we're obviously just seeing different volumes and varying levels. Again, like we're seeing a surge in empty boxes that are now, making their way back across the Pacific. So that's not adding a lot of value to the work that we do, or certainly to our economy. We like to see those boxes go back full of goods, either from a manufactured standpoint, an ag standpoint. So no strings have been impacted at this point. We did actually see last year, though, because of that backup, a couple of the lines that would normally say go to like Los Angeles and then Oakland and then back to Asia, they would just skip a route entirely because they were needing to make sure that they were on schedule for their next deployment.
We do have a labor representative in the next panel. Do you have a sense of how this is impacting jobs related to increase or decrease of traffic?
Yeah, well, certainly from a port perspective, I think that there's enough business to go around, so we haven't seen sort of any, backups of folks not being called out to the terminals. Certainly, as it affects the ecosystem throughout the entire supply chain, I mean, in the short term, it may be hard to measure. If this were to continue over the long term, that's undoubtable that this is going to have long-term impacts to our economy and certainly to our workforce.
I'll move this over to Ms. Jensen. I think from a consumer perspective, we understand like waves of trade, if we think about it this deeply, when the newest cell phone comes out. And okay, there's a new Galaxy or there's a new iPhone. This is going to be certain seasons where this is going to occur around, Christmas time type of sales as well for big items. And so, where does that pressure point hit some of your members that are dealing with that type of a technology or looking to push their technology out on those new models?
Yeah, I think, we're still trying to figure out the short-term and long-term impacts. I mean, I think we're all hoping this gets dealt with quick so that we don't have those impacts, right? Those, very expensive impacts. I think there's impacts from a individual consumer household standpoint and then also on our businesses, right? Because technology is used as, I stated in my comments, but technology is used from a personal standpoint, your personal use of your cell phone and all of those other things, but technology is also used by our businesses in order to create more jobs in California, to do more efficiency. And so I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the impacts, and we've been seeing the impacts from tariffs and from sort of the unfair trade practices in general to those types of data centers, to the larger technology projects that have been going on, that business to business usage. And then when we drill down, if this tariff war continues long term, we're going to see impacts and we're going to see costs go up for the individual consumer.
Do you see a shift in where components are manufactured?
Sorry, say it.
Do you see a shift in where components are manufactured?
It's always an option, right, of where it's manufactured. If it gets too expensive to manufacture them in California, yeah, I could see, manufacturing happen for using parts that are manufactured in other countries, or moving data center manufacturing to other countries, producing those in different countries. I mean, if this long-term trade war goes on, I think businesses are really going to have to figure out sort of what their breaking point is, and what consumers' breaking point is too. I mean, if we continue to manufacture here, but we put it out on the market and it's not affordable for the average consumer, then that's not good for anybody. So there's going to be a breaking point at some point.
Members, any other questions? I want to say thank you so much to the three of you. Oh, we do got one, Mr. Bloom. Thank you.
I actually want to add a comment. We tend to look at these issues through our own eyes. It's the mobile phone that we might not buy, or it'll be more expensive, or the refrigerator, or the clothing at the store. These issues will have a dramatic impact on those who are living in deep poverty as well. And we learned today that the level of homelessness in the city of Los Angeles and Los Angeles County have increased fairly dramatically over the past year. For those folks who are paying more than 50% of their net spendable income on their housing costs, they have that much less to pay for the staples that they might buy at the local bodega or retail shop. Those brick and mortar shops that might now close down and be further away, so it's a longer drive, it takes more gas, it takes time away from work and families. And these folks are already paying higher prices because the places where they shop typically are more expensive. So what might seem a deferral of something that I have a choice over has a ripple effect for those who are living in deep poverty that is far greater than will ever impact any of us in our ongoing lives, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of this as we're having that conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Bloom, and thank you very much, panelists. Next, I would like to introduce and welcome up Honor Comfort, the Vice President of International Marketing of the Wine Institute, Dave Puglia, the Executive Vice President of Western Growers Association, and Michael Young, the Legislative Advocate for the California Labor Federation. Welcome to the three of you. Thank you so much for your patience. So glad that you're all here. Ms. Comfort, if you'd like to begin.
Yes, thank you. I'm Honor Comfort with the Wine Institute. I'm the Vice President of International Marketing. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to join you today and talk with you about something that is having a direct impact on our members. So first, a few words about the Wine Institute. We represent over 1,000 wineries within the state of California, which represents 80% of California's wine production. The export arm of our business is a significantly important part of the wine industry, and U.S. wine export reached just over $1.5 billion in 2018. And when we talk about U.S. wine, more than 95% of that is California. So we're really talking about California. The tariffs on China have been a significant deterrent to growth in one of our most important markets. While China ranks 5th in terms of our total export sales, it has been the fastest growing market for California wine. We've been exporting into China for over 20 years. And we recognize that developing emerging markets, developing new routes to market for our wines takes time. We recognize that there are frequently bumps in the road and headwinds as we do that. However, that investment of time and money by our members to develop the relationships that lead to effective sales of California wine in these markets has been greatly hampered by what we're seeing going on in trade policy currently. China in 2018 represented just under $60 million in exports, and combined with Hong Kong, another $130 million, so almost $200 million in export. At the end of 2018, we saw that sales growth decline by 25%. When we look at the first quarter of 2019, we're seeing that trend continue at almost double. So a decline almost double. Sobering. What's significant in terms of that decline is that prior to that, we were seeing China and Hong Kong together being one of the fastest growing markets that in the time that we'd been exporting had grown over 450% in growth over the past decade. So a complete reversal. As we're going forward, and I just touched on the value of the revenues of export wines to China and Hong Kong, and that growth represented overall, the Lieutenant Governor did an excellent job of walking through the evolution of tariffs that we've seen over the recent 2 years. And what was interesting is comparing that, as she talked about the accumulation of tariff and tax against goods within the wine industry. One of our challenges is that we, of course, are going head-to-head with competitive wine regions. Of course, our friends over in the EU, Australia, New Zealand, etc. South Africa, absolutely. And so in this environment, we find ourselves playing not on a level playing field. The combination of tariffs and taxes that we were dealing with has now increased up to a 93% on top of the price of goods, almost doubling the cost of California wine into China. And for our competitive regions, those regions, many of them, so Australia, Chile, and New Zealand in particular, they have zero tariff. They're really only facing a tax that leads to 23%, whereas for the European Union, they're at a total of 48.6%. So we are more than double even our closest competitors. Simultaneously, we're dealing with an environment in which many of our competitive regions have significant government subsidies supporting their marketing efforts into those markets. For example, U.S. wine operates at just 3% of what the EU receives, particularly Italy and France, for supporting their marketing efforts. What that means is they're receiving $238 million annually to support wine export sales, compared to the $6 million that California receives from the Federal Agriculture Service to support our sales. So in light of that, the addition of the tax and tariff situation is particularly challenging for us. And when we talk about the impacts of how this affects the industry, it doesn't just flow to the winery owners or the wineries themselves. As it was so interesting to sit and listen to our colleagues in the first panel and looking at my colleagues on this panel, and that the wine industry is unique in that I sit and link arms and partner with each of their partners, the ports, of course, the retailers, technology, the involvement of technology in the wine industry, of course, the growers and labor are key factors within the wine industry. And so the impact of these tariffs flow all the way through the wine industry, impacting the vineyard owners and the growers, the winery workers, the suppliers that we work with in terms of glass, cork, shipping, label production, of course, labor. The economic impact of wine as a value-added product far exceeds just the gross production of what we do. So these impacts have a bigger footprint within the market and here within California. Significantly, it also, as I mentioned, it takes time to develop these markets. As I mentioned, we've been working for over 20 years to cultivate our sales into China. It also takes time to then reverse the impacts of these tariffs. If these tariffs were to be removed tomorrow, which would be a blessing, but we know a long shot, it would take another 10+ years to regain the placement and the sales back into China. The reason for that is because, first and foremost, it's built on relationships, cultivating relationships with the importers, the agents, and the accounts where we sell our wines. Once those relationships are damaged, they need to be rebuilt. Also, the purchase of wine is a choice. And there's a lot of choice out there in the marketplace. It's a choice by the retailer or the importer who brings those wines in. It's a choice by the consumer. So if California wine is no longer available, is no longer in that shelf space, there is another wine that replaces that space. That wine's coming from Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Italy, or France. So to regain those positions, that's what takes time. And we would, during this time of the tariffs, not only are we losing out on the opportunity of the current sales, we're losing out on the developmental opportunity of that market over the next 5, 10 to 15 years. So in fact, as an industry, we're losing twice. We're looking to replace these sales by developing other markets within Asia. However, it's difficult to replace the fastest growing market for our industry. Today we're talking about China, but interestingly, what we're really facing within the wine industry are challenges and headwinds across all of our major markets. Our single largest export market is the EU and UK. With the threat of tariffs within the airline industry and retaliatory tariffs there, along with Brexit, that's an additional headwind. Our second and single largest single market is Canada, and the impact and threat of tariffs that we've been dealing with there. Hong Kong is our third largest, and then China is our fifth largest, as I said. So this is a situation where the impacts are extensive and lasting. And one of the other significant challenges that we have is that as the price of our goods increases in the marketplace, we do not have the option to pick up and find sourcing in a more affordable place. We can't pick up our vineyards and our wineries and move them someplace else. Unfortunately, we have to either raise our prices or cut production. We have to cut the prices that we're willing to pay to our growers. We have to reduce the production that we have overall, and therefore we hire fewer bottling lines, we reduce our cellar staff, we purchase fewer goods. So it really is a trickle down through the entire system. That's the impact that we have. So while we are taking the long-term view, and by no means are we turning our back on this market, we're continuing to invest in developing the presence for California wines by pursuing educational programs, educating consumers and trade, hosting master classes, inviting trade delegations here to California to meet our growers, to meet our winemakers, to continue to convey the value and the quality and the character of California wines. We are absolutely hopeful that we'll be able to resolve this quickly so that we can move forward and move past the situation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Comfort. Mr. Puglia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairwoman, and members for allowing us to be part of this hearing today. It's very gratifying to know that there's so much attention being paid to this because you've heard a lot about the impacts. They are very serious. I won't go too much farther into that because you've had so much good data given you today. But I will touch on a few things. Quickly, Western Growers as an organization represents the fresh produce industry. Our growers and shippers in 4 states, most of them in California, also Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, produce about half the nation's fresh produce, both organic and conventional. That includes fresh fruits, vegetables, tree nuts. So you all have, to some degree, are members in your districts. I think even Mr. Bloom has a little bit, if I'm not mistaken. And I will say this, California is blessed and cursed in some ways with this diversity of agriculture. We have over 300 crops, a lot of farmers of different size and scale, and as a result, you have a lot of ag trade associations that you all have to deal with, Madam Chairwoman, especially for you. And any number of my colleagues could have been here today and would have been equally capable in providing you some information. So thank you for the opportunity to sit in this chair on all of their behalf for the moment. Dr. Sumner outlined the impacts that we're seeing pretty clearly. His colleagues produced a report in the fall that estimated that to date the damage from the Chinese retaliatory tariffs is about $3.3 billion to the ag sector. When you put that up against the $20.5 billion in ag exports from California to China every year, you're talking about a pretty whopping percentage in a very short period of time. So this is a severe hit to the industry and one that has everybody's attention. I want to tick off a couple more numbers, and then I want to get a little bit into the federal mitigation program, because I think it's important to understand where it can work and where it probably can't work, and then that gets us into desired outcomes. Some of the data I'm going to present come from our friends in the almond sector, the Almond Alliance California, American pistachio growers, some of my other colleagues, so I want to give them proper credit. I think it was mentioned earlier, almonds export 67% of the crop out of California. Tariffs have already caused a 1/3 reduction in those tonnage numbers. And Australia, by the way, which didn't have a huge almond production capability, is increasing it quickly. They have now increased their exports of almonds to China by nearly 2,000%. Now, that's coming from a small base, but it tells you where their eyes and where their heads are pointed, and they're not the only ones. Almond tariffs are now 50% on bulk product, 28% on processed or canned product. Pistachios, by the way, was mentioned earlier by Dr. Sumner that because Iran had a failed crop last year, our pistachio growers largely dodged the impacts from the tariffs. And I think he was very appropriate in noting that that is not something we can count on. The tariffs on pistachios are now 45%, and that was at 5% prior. So they're in harm's way. I'll mention pecans also. We don't have a lot of pecan production in California, but we do in the West. It's a growth industry in the nut sector in the western part of the U.S. There, the tariffs have gone up to 43% from, I believe it was 47%, I believe, from 7%. They've seen year-over-year prices drop by 43%. So we just see this accumulation of product now with nowhere to park it. And that goes to, within the diverse array of California farm products, it is the permanent crop producers who are really in trouble here if this continues. They can't turn the trees off, they can't turn the vines off. They're going to produce that crop, and you got to find some place to put it. I will say this, resolving this satisfactorily is, of course, critical for permanent crop farmers, but it's just as critical for every other farmer in California because everybody wants to be like almonds. Everybody wants to find that market in China and elsewhere in Asia to be able to export and get the returns that the almond sector and the pistachio sector have gotten in China. So that gets me into a quick discussion about the USDA mitigation programs that have been initiated. The first was announced last year at $12 billion, was later scaled back to about $10 billion, and it was noted earlier by others, that primarily went to Midwestern soybean, corn, wheat producers, pork producers. A little bit came to our almond and nut producers in California, but not very much. The second tranche, or the second program just announced by the administration, is $16 billion, with $14.5 billion going to market facilitation, which is another way of saying purchasing surplus product. There again, we expect that that's going to largely go to the Midwest, but there's a bit of a recognition in this program that we have additional crops in California and producers in California who ought to have access to those funds. So they expanded it beyond almonds to include pistachios. Cherries are involved, and some other permanent crops as well, such as table grapes. One of the challenges there is, of course, that in the fresh produce sector in the United States, we've never had direct payment subsidies from the federal government, have never wanted them for various reasons, mostly having to do with the stifling effect that subsidies have on innovation and on competition, market signals that my members appreciate more than they do subsidies. And as Dr. Sumner noted, the federal government just isn't isn't built to move direct payments to fresh produce growers in an efficient way. So we don't know how well this is going to roll out. We do know that farmers in the Midwest who are used to and have that relationship with the USDA are going to be accessing the program quickly. So we're trying to hustle through the process to make sure our members are in position to be able to put in a claim for as much as they can to offset some of their lost market. But what was really critically stated earlier is that we don't want those direct payments. We need this to end. We need to get back to what we do best, which is producing the best products in the world and marketing them across the world to people who want them and have shown that in their purchasing decisions. Really critical point for the outcome here, and we can talk about how we get to an outcome, whether it's one side or they're blinking in this terrible game of chicken, or we go back to a WTO type process, above my pay grade. But one very important point we want to emphasize is that when this is resolved, for the produce sector in California and the West particularly, we can't just return to status quo ante. We have suffered for years, despite some success with almonds and pistachios and other products, wine certainly moving into China. Fresh produce commodities have been hit with non-tariff barriers around the world, and China's been no exception, particularly alleged threats that our products coming in, our fresh products coming into China, contain a bug or a disease that then give them justification under WTO rules to throw up the walls and keep our product out and protect their domestic producers in an unfair manner. We challenge those all the time as an industry, but China has not been responsive to the normal give and take in the WTO process of resolving those non-tariff trade barriers. And so we need stronger protections around sanitary and phytosanitary non-tariff trade barriers that have been used to keep American product out of China in the past. And by the way, that is something that we called for in the NAFTA 2.0 or the USMCA agreement, and we see some improvements in the sanitary and phytosanitary protocols there. So really, really important that we don't just go back to status quo ante. One other point I'll make, and then I'll stop, is that as others have said earlier, the danger here is that others are seeking to replace our markets. I mentioned Australian almond producers who are now upping their exports to China. It's not limited to them. It's every commodity that we currently are able to put into the Chinese marketplace, and it's coming from around the world. In this debate within the ag industry and its projection of priorities to the administration, it's really the Midwestern farmers who are driving that, because they're more easily replaceable if you think about it. Soybeans, corn, wheat can be produced in a lot of places in the world. Almonds, pistachios, far fewer places in the world. But the point I made earlier applies even more. Every grower in California, strawberries, celery, vine-ripened tomatoes, broccoli, and go down a list, berries, they all want to be able to export, and they all think they can, and they probably can, given a fair shot. And so we can't allow, as this is resolved, the Midwestern crop producers to dominate the outcome, to set the protocols going forward for what this new trade relationship looks like, however we get over that finish line. There has to be a produce sector and a West Coast imprint on the resolution of this dispute or this war. Finally, I can't emphasize this enough. Others have said it quite well. We can't tolerate this that much longer. Our president of Western Growers, Ambassador Tom Nassif, wrote quite plainly some time ago that while we understand the goal to forge new and fairer trade agreements, particularly with China, those agreements will only benefit American farmers if they haven't permanently lost their relationships with foreign buyers, and that is happening now. And then he wrote, in other words, we need this administration to drive this process to conclusion quickly. Quickly underlined 6 times. We're running out of time for many of our producers, I'm afraid. Final point I make, Mr. Chairman, Chairwoman Eggman made this point in another way. California has been blessed to have, as I said earlier, this diversity of farmers of all sizes producing over 300 different products. But we've seen a movement to consolidation. We've seen the larger players who can withstand higher costs of production that are unique to California absorb those smaller farms. California already requires higher production costs. A Cal Poly San Luis Obispo study recently showed that for a lettuce producer in Salinas, in 2006, regulatory costs were $109 per acre. 2017, now $977 per acre. You load that on top of the impacts we now have from the tariff war, and I'm afraid we're going to see more consolidation, more loss of small farmers who can't stretch their financing capabilities through this war. So if there is an ability of this body to look at that regulatory disparity that is unique to California farmers relative to those we compete against in other states and other countries, now's the time, because the costs that are now loading on top of those regulatory costs are probably going to be unbearable for the smaller farmers we're trying to protect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Puglia. Mr. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, members. I'm Michael Young with the California Labor Federation. We represent about 1,200 unions across the state, and that includes about 2.1 million union members. As you can imagine, we come at this issue a little bit differently, with our primary focus being that of labor workers and their family, and also considering the fact that I understand I'm the last panelist on a long day. I'll keep my comments brief. The AFL has maintained for many years and for many administrations that tariffs are an important part of enforcement. If you violate the rules, you should face consequences, and one of those consequences can be tariffs. However, tariffs need to be targeted and not widely cast without any plan or strategy around them. Right now, our trade relationship with China is being used by a handful of banks and corporations to hold wages down in both countries and create an untenable trade deficit in the United States. And I think if you're going to have the conversation about the impact of the tariffs on China has to be looked more broadly at, and considering our growing trade deficit with China as well. The growth of the U.S. trade deficit with China has increased by well over $100 billion since the Great Recession, playing a large role in why manufacturing employment hasn't fully returned despite the growth of the economy over that time frame. The growing trade deficit has resulted in job losses in every state in the country and every congressional district. Of the top 10 hardest hit states, when looking at job losses, the share of total state employment, California is third. And of the 5 hardest hit states, based on off of total job loss, California is first with about 562,000 jobs lost since 2001. And in order to start fixing the stagnant wage growth and job losses created, or that's been the cause by this growing deficit, any trade talks with China should include 2 principles. And one of those is that it should include a multilateral approach that strengthens our allies and maximizes our leverage at the negotiating table. And second, while the U.S. can recognize China's right to develop its economy, but we have to be clear that China can't be allowed to do so in a way that undermines labor rights and destabilizes other economies. That means addressing labor and human rights violations. Tariffs aren't an end goal, but they can be an important tool to end trade practices that kill American jobs and drive American wages down. However, overall, the Trump administration's trade practices have yielded imbalance. The tariff war with China, it just isn't working, and it won't so long as the key goal is to protect profits instead of jobs and the rights of working people. The U.S.'s failure to adequately enforce existing rules is why there is so much pent-up frustration among many workers and domestic producers over trade with China. Our trade enforcement measures should prioritize things like good jobs, workers' rights, democracy, environmental compliance, consumer safety protections over outsourcing or even short-term profits. We need long-term economic development strategies that use domestic tax, infrastructure, workforce development policies to ensure that American workers and businesses have the tools and skills they need to compete successfully. But the government also needs to strengthen our trade compliance and enforcement measures, and be willing to use them aggressively, consistently, but most importantly, strategically, to ensure that our trade relationship with China is reciprocal and fair. And American workers and families continue to be protected. So, thank you.
Mr. Young, thank you very much. I'm not trying to take a poll from the 3 of you, and Ms. Michelin, if you want to join, since you're from the last panel, the one last person standing from there, with some of the questions that we might have, because I think that we've got some things that might be germane for you as well. We got a seat right there for you. I'm not trying to take a poll. You don't need to say where your industry groups stood on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but TPP could have set some ground rules and a framework for how trade worked between the United States and a great deal of Asia, including China. The United States retreated from TPP, allowing China to dictate trade more aggressively than the United States did by creating a framework with other countries, leaving the United States out. And this is a negotiating tactic that is favored by President Trump to negotiate one-on-one rather than in partnership with other countries. Do you think TPP would have helped California and, of course, the United States avoid the current quagmire? Anyone want to go first on that one?
I'll be happy to speak.
Thank you.
here.
Yeah.
TPP, no longer being included in TPP has had a significant impact for California wine exports. So Japan is the fourth largest export market for us. It's a very stable and mature market. It's also very high value in that we're able to export wines all up and down the price scale. So it's significantly important to us. Of course, our largest competitive wine regions are are in a free trade or a zero impact relationship with Japan, whereas we, of course, are not in that position. So we're hopeful that we can get back to a free trade agreement with Japan, but it absolutely has had an impact for the wine industry. And that, coupled with the current situation in China, has just taken that entire region and created headwinds that have slowed our development.
Yeah. Any other perspectives on TPP? Mr. Julia.
Mr. Chairman, we supported the TPP, prefer that it would have held together. Having said that, relative to agriculture, at least the fresh produce sector, we have seen some positive bilateral agreements either occur or take shape. The Korean bilateral, for sure, was helpful. We're getting good vibes on the negotiations with Japan. We'll see. But clearly, a more efficient way to do this would have been through TPP, and we preferred that.
Yeah, Mr. Young.
Yeah, the AFL opposed the TPP, and I think it failed to include significant worker protections that we believe to be important, particularly when you look at the impact of failing to do so in previous trade deals, including NAFTA and its impact in the Midwest. I think there was strong hesitation from workers and unions to support something moving forward that, again, didn't have a strong enforcement mechanism for the lack of labor protections and our ability to compete globally.
Ms. Michelin, did you want to? So, Mr. Young, perhaps maybe with another president, some of the protections that you were looking for would have been in place that TPP did not include at the time. Do you see that playing out in the bilateral negotiations that are taking place with countries? Or no, they're not part of that because we have a president who's not as focused, or perhaps he is?
You mean the bilateral conversations between?
That's right. All the other countries, with the one-on-one conversations. Are labor concerns that were valid on TPP criticism, being present in those negotiations?
Well, I mean, hopefully in the next administration that will be the case. I don't think our concerns are being carried out in those conversations, but again, I think we have a very democratic process moving forward, and I think workers more and more are understanding the impact of these trade agreements on their ability to work, right? So yeah, I don't want to stray too far away from the AFL's position on this, but I think again, I think the focus being on some enforcement mechanism to worker protections and a fair approach to how trade is going to be approached instead of just looking at it as a free and cost approach is probably best.
When you look at the tariffs that have been imposed by the Trump administration, and then of course the retaliatory tariffs, do you believe that some of this activity on the United States part will lead to more job growth and creation in the United States? That would be, perhaps despite the retaliatory nature, because manufacturing may leave China, may create jobs here in the United States.
I don't know, and I think it's probably too early to say. I think Trump's approach to the tariffs with China just doesn't, again, seem to have any sort of strategy or goal, which can be harmful to workers here. So I think there is a universal goal of having these issues resolved quickly, but I think more broadly, outside of looking at the specific tariffs against China, I think the labor movement has supported tariffs that are strategic in their own scope, that are connected to a strategic goal, and lacking that here creates some harmful trickle-down effects that affect businesses, but also affect like workers' wages, but also their ability to buy and consume products.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Puglia, you talk about the $16 billion in subsidies. We've heard that a criticism from California's perspective, a lot of that will go to the Midwest. How much do you think will make it to the California market?
It's a great question. I don't know. A lot of this depends on how many of our farmers go through the process of application and get timely response from USDA. Again, the mechanisms aren't really there. We're creating them on the fly. I will say the second program, the $16 billion program, made one critical improvement over the first one. The first one had an adjusted gross income threshold of, I believe it was $900,000, above which you could not apply. Well, in California, we have farmers whose AGI tends to be there or maybe a little higher because we have larger operations in multiple parts of the state. So they did away with that AGI threshold. That should help us, but I can't give you a good estimate yet. Okay. By the way, on that $16 billion, the administration tends to roll that out in 3 tranches. We'd like to see it come maybe in 2 tranches or 1, and not stretch it out.
Members, do you have any other questions at this point? Any closing? We don't usually do closing comments, but did you not get a chance to say something that you wanted to say? I'm just grateful that you guys lasted. That you have. We care a lot about your members and the impacts on California, and so we're grateful that you participated as with the other panelists as well. So thank you for that. Madam Co-Chair, do you have any remarks that you'd like to say?
No, I'd also just say thank you very much. And, you know, of course, then we're all sitting here reflecting, and nobody's got the crystal ball, like, how long can you last, right? And even if, right, we weather the storm for a while, how do we trust then that another carpet won't get tugged, which I think, again, just adds to the uncertainty that is the bane of business.
We're going to go to a public comment period. As we move to thank you again, panelists. As we go to public comment, I should have stated at the beginning of the hearing that we did invite the Republic of China to participate, and we did not get a response. We did invite the U.S. Trade Representative to participate as well. So thank you for that clarification as well. Dr. Eggman, this is important to hear from them, but we didn't get a response in addition. All right, we'll go to that microphone, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Elaine Trevino. I'm the president of the Almond Alliance. Thank you, chairs, for
the largest export in California.
The largest export, and so I had to say something, right? I'd be remiss not to. And Mr. Puglia stole most of the thunder, so thank you, Dave. Thank you for helping me out. But there are some things I just want to touch on, especially pertaining to the question: what can the legislature do? What can the administration do? And some of the things that I just want to highlight. So I'll try to be quick. And just want to do some highlights here. We generate about 104,000 jobs statewide, 97,000 of those in the Central Valley, especially in high chronic unemployment areas. So that's significant. We generate about $21 billion in the economic revenue, directly $11 billion to the state's total economy. This last year, well, actually in 2017, our exports were valued at about $4.5 billion. Which substantially contributes to the agricultural trade surplus. Obviously, we're one of the top 3 valued commodities. We were targeted in 2018, April 2nd, with the 232s. And so it's just not China for us, but Turkey. That 25% has not changed in Turkey. It's a significant market. It's not our largest, but it's a significant. So this prolonged trade dispute has hurt the industry. David mentioned some numbers. I won't repeat them. I do want to say that if you look specifically at direct China shipments, which we have argued with the USDA economist in terms of Hong Kong, China, but that's a whole different discussion. We're looking at the first quarter of 2019, we're about 60% of what we shipped in the first quarter of 2018. So that's a substantial change, as was indicated too. Meanwhile, Australia is looking over that 11-month same term at about an increase of 2,000%. Now, this is significant because Australia is actually moving its exports into other countries, into China. Because when they know that there is a resolution, they want to saturate that market. And when they know that over the last 10 years, we've invested $74 million in that market in China to open and expand that market. And they are taking very good advantage of that with 0% tariff as a result of the WTO agreement. So in closing, I want to say that, we're interested in trade and market growth. We've spent a lot of time in DC. I think that's one of the areas I want to focus on. I go to these trade events, these discussions with the secretary and with administration and with OMB, and you just see the Midwest presence, and you see California's presence. And it goes back to even the day when I worked in the administration. You have 3 or 4 lobbyists for a state this big, and it just infuriates you, aside from the good old days when we had trade and commerce reps in key markets. And I would hope that someday soon, that we re-examine that, especially not just in agriculture from a selfish perspective, but just how much the international economy is important to California. So looking at that option is, I think, important and something that we would encourage. And the presence in DC is just my number one ask and request. And just a unified voice. I know agriculture, we've worked towards that with UC Davis in terms of the numbers, educating the economists. You put the 2 economists together, you can be farther apart. So that's always helpful to have the intermediaries as translators coming from the agricultural industry. I always say I'm trilingual. I speak agriculture, economics, right? I speak bureaucracy. I speak Spanish and English too. But anyways, so just want to put an end to this. We're waiting as everyone else. And stability is critical to our buyers, and we want to be part of the solution, but also want to express the pain that it has caused the industry, because it's significant, and that is why we have been vocal in the mitigation. So thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful that you were able to be here on behalf of almond growers.
Thank you. Thank you for the time.
You're welcome. Without seeing any other people for public comment, yes, Mr. Bloom.
I just want to thank the 2 of you for putting this together. It's been extremely informative and helpful.
Thank you, and this is going to be an issue that we will continue to track as we look at the impacts of decision-making on California from beyond our borders. Thank you. This hearing is ended.